So we're here for this 140th anniversary of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which many people don't know about today, but it involved at least 100,000 workers. More than 100 people were killed. Half the U.S. Army had to come in to put it down. And so, as Bill has written about in his book, we're here to kind of talk about the unknown history from that period and also why it's relevant today. So talk about the struggles that the railroad unions are experiencing now in the context of this strike that happened 140 years ago. Are there any parallels to what's happening now to what happened in the past?
Well, there is, because today there are great demands placed on locomotive engineers and conductors to work a lot of hours. Railroads are trying to get the most out of their manpower, and they don't want them to have time off. And even though employees might work 60 hours in a week, if they took 2 days in a row off on a weekend, they would be, gently advised that they're setting a pattern for absenteeism, and that, they hire full-time employees, and even though you work 60 hours that week, that's if you refused an assignment or you wanted a day off, you were no longer a full-time employee and not the kind of person that they're interested in have work for them.
So it sounds like mostly concerns about working conditions and hours, which were things that unions fought over a century ago and more.
Well, that's true. And the battles that were fought back in 1877 and continuing forward had a lot to do with how the labor laws in regards to railroads were formulated, because after upheavals, they called it an upheaval.
They called it a riot. They called it an insurrection.
Insurrection, that's right. It was a strike. The effect that it had on the economy, legislators got together to prevent this sort of interruption, and so they eventually crafted the Railway Labor Act so that it makes it extremely difficult for rail employees to go on strike. You can eventually get there, but you have to resolve your issues through binding arbitration, and you have to work your way through a very long process before you would ever be permitted to seek self-help. And when you get to that point, even now, if there's going to be any major interruption in commerce, which there almost always is, they can put you back to work, and they can assign your case to a presidential emergency board, which they make recommendations. If you don't accept them, they send them to Congress and they vote them in, and you get it anyways. So it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for rail workers to go on strike unless a major dispute was to come, confront the workers. And essentially, the railroads would have to just flat out walk away or abrogate portions of the collective bargaining agreement to reach that status. And so if they went to court and asked for permission to go on strike, the judge would look at it and see whether or not it was a matter of interpretation, which would be considered a minor dispute, and you have to resolve it through binding arbitration, or in fact, if you did have a major dispute. Very, very few cases ever, or incidences ever, reach the level of major dispute today. So most everything we do is handled through the Railway Labor Act, and it's stepped through the National Mediation Board to resolve through binding arbitration.
And so, talk about what you're experiencing in the railroad union, sort of in the larger context of unions in America today, because we know that membership has been falling over the last several decades, and now we have an administration that is openly anti-union. What impact has that had on your workers?
Well, at this point, the biggest attack against us that's looming on the horizon is right to work, national right to work legislation. At the moment, the way it's designed, it may not apply to rail workers under the Railway Labor Act, but it wouldn't take much if they were able to get a majority, in the Senate and the Congress to create a right to work legislation that would change the Railway Labor Act as well. And basically, we view that as an attack on labor, because they know that it's not really about the unfairness of a person having to pay a fee or union dues to support their organization to speak on their behalf in collective bargaining, what they view it is that if we can tell them that they don't have to pay, then people will stop paying dues if they don't have to, and they hope that enough people will drop out from paying dues that they'll no longer be able to function financially, and that the unions will go away. So it's really an attack on trade unionism, and it's not all about the poor guy has to pay dues. They know that what will happen in the end result will eliminate trade unionism, and once that's gone, then they'll have their way with labor once again, long before the unions ever arrive.
So today, in history books and textbooks, the history of labor in this country, it's hard to find. There's hardly any mentions of it. You know, most people don't know about the strike, the Great Strike of 1877. What efforts is your union doing to educate its members about the history of the fights that have happened in the past and how that's affecting them today?
Well, through our trade journal, the Locomotive Engineer, the Engineers Journal, the president and others, do op-ed pieces in there and talk about the benefits of being in the union and what it means, and talks about, at different times, what's happened in the past and what people fought for to achieve the level of contracts and benefits that we have today, and try to educate the young men that are coming along now who really weren't engaged in those fights and don't realize that the difficulties that were involved in achieving the contracts that they have, and not to take them for granted. And that takes some education. And our president, Dennis Pierce, is busy doing the best he can to do that.
I guess one of the things that I've been learning about the railroad strike of 1877 is that there was an enormous amount of participation from the communities where the workers came from and other industries that operated in solidarity with the striking workers. Do you think that's still an important aspect of the movement today, that relationship between workers and the communities they come from, at a time when, again, there isn't that much knowledge about labor and its importance in American history?
Well, it really doesn't exist like it did in 1877. Railroads were much more labor intensive in those days. Many more people to operate the railroad. Today, through advances in all kinds of technology, the workforce has been dramatically reduced. And so in those days, a large portion of any given town where the railroad ran were employed by railroads, and every family had railroad workers in it. So if something happened to their family member, it happened to them. And so an injustice to them was an injustice to the family, and they stood up to protect them. And that's what happened in those days. A lot of those folks that were called in to try to enforce or break the strike in those days had family members that worked on the railroad, and they couldn't bring themselves to stand up against their relatives and their families and so forth. But today, there's so few rail workers in comparison that sort of moral majority for railroad workers doesn't exist today.
And I guess the railroad strike of 1877 was one of the first times when people were directly confronting corporate power and corporate greed, and arguing that your profits are not worth more than my livelihood and the livelihood of my community. I think in the last few years that sort of has resurfaced in American culture with the Occupy movement and other recent labor struggles. Do you think that's true? That again, people are realizing this conflict, this sort of essential conflict between corporate power and human, and like that, the workers, and how that is a sort of a fundamental struggle in American society today?
Well, the extreme right wing doesn't like trade unionism because when you go to work, they want to be able to do with you as they will. And so they try to convince people that union is bad for them, and they try to convince people that this highly paid union worker or higher paid union worker with benefits, you don't have that, and that's wrong, and they shouldn't have all that. That's wrong to have that. And so instead of wanting to rise to the level of the trade unionist and get a better job, a higher paying job by belonging to a trade union, they try to convince them that the thing to do is to become anti-union and take the union down so that he'll make less or get paid on the level that the lower paid workers are. And a lot of them, favoritism is one of the biggest problems in companies. So a young man comes in and he can work harder, faster, and he thinks he should have the job of the older worker because he's a better guy, and he's very willing to push the older worker aside. And this is unfortunately the mentality that we face in a lot of today, and that's why a lot of young folks think that trade unionism is bad, because if you go on a seniority roster, you have to wait your turn to work your way up through the seniority list to get the better jobs. They want the better jobs now. And so there's a lot of looking at themselves only in their thinking, and that's part of the problem. And so it is difficult. But one of the biggest problems that we face, though, is that when the big corporations that were unionized in the Northeast, especially the woolen mills and all of the shoe shops and all of those companies in the Northeast, New England, and they moved those companies to the South to get away from the trade unions. They left all the millions of dollars of infrastructure behind, right, so that they could get cheap labor. And then when the union trade movement caught up with them, they moved them offshore. And so all the big businesses left and all the good union jobs have gone with them. And it's unfortunate, but they've been able to outsource, and they've been outsourcing since the 40s and 50s and taking all the good jobs from the United States so that they can make more money. And even today around the world, they've moved their businesses to China and other places where wages are catching up, and now they're moving to even poorer countries in Africa and other places to do the same thing. And so eventually it'll stop, but probably long after we're all gone.